Spending well, spending with accountability.
All right. Hi, everyone. Happy Wednesday. It's great to have you all here. My name is Ravi Agrawal. I'm the editor-in-chief of Foreign Policy magazine. It's a great honor and pleasure to be here today at the IMF after a while for me personally. You know, economics is very important to us at Foreign Policy. We have a new print issue, which I urge you all to take a look at, where we examine America's trade policy with some terrific economists, Adam Posen, Isra Prasad, USTR Catherine Tai, and it's really sparked a debate in this town, so I urge you to take a look. But what we're here today to discuss is a very interesting topic. It is spending well and spending with accountability. And I have a terrific panel here that I'm going to introduce, and then I'm just going to explain what the panel is about. So I have, starting from my immediate left, I have Nancy Gathungu. She's the Auditor General from Kenya. To her left, I have Antoinette Sayeh, the Deputy Managing Director of the IMF. To her left, I have Delina Ibrahimaj, the Minister of Finance and Economy from Albania. And to her left, finally, Marcel, the Finance Minister of Chile. Let's just have another quick round of applause for our panelists, please. So, spending well and spending with accountability. I think those two words, well and accountability, are very important because they go hand in hand. And as you'll see in this panel, it'll be a theme of our discussion. Given what the world faces today, we've all become very familiar with the term polycrisis, but if you list out the range of crises that every economy has been confronted with over the last 3 years, there's a thread that runs through them in terms of not just how countries are impacted, but how people are impacted. And the people element here is real because when any economy has trouble, that sort of trickles down to people very quickly, and that leads to anything from unrest to anger to worries about inequality. And one of the things that people tend to be angry about is a lack of trust in the system or a lack of transparency. And that's why it is so important to think about not just spending well, not just doing good as policymakers, but thinking about how to do so with accountability, so responsibly and with transparency. So all of that said, there are smarter minds here than mine to dive into how to do this. I'm just here to ask the questions. But DMD Sayeh, I thought I'd begin with you just to sort of lay out the stakes of why this is important, but also the very particular challenges that you have heard about from all of the IMF's member governments around the world, the challenges that they've faced to do this over the last 3 years.
Well, no, thank you so much, Ravi, for doing this with us. And just to maybe start by speaking to where we're coming from. It's been 3 years, of course, we all know, since the pandemic, and we know how governments have been trying to respond to that first shock and the subsequent shocks that we've had since then. And we're often speaking of shock upon shock, which is absolutely what policymakers have been grappling with on the pressures upon them to spend and to respond to lift up the economy and to support the economy through some very difficult times. So just in the first couple of years of the pandemic, 2020, 2021, altogether our governments across the world put out some $17 trillion to lift up their economies, and of course then subsequently got hit by the invasion in Ukraine and the fallout from that, of course food crisis, the cost of living crisis that they've been grappling with also in 2022. And so by the end of 2022, some 92% of GDP in debt is what the world then had accumulated, which was significantly larger than what had been there pre-pandemic. So now, of course, governments are still under immense pressures, spending pressures, because we know that the food crisis is still there for the most vulnerable countries that they're grappling with. Of course, there are long existing pressures that were there before, the aging crisis in advanced countries and the pressures on pensions, for example, that we've been watching what's been happening in France, for example. There are, of course, pressures that have been there all along on lower income countries in meeting the Sustainable Development Goals. Now with the divergence that they've had in terms of their performance relative to advanced economies and the pressures on their budgets, added to that all of the consequences of the pandemic and the war in Ukraine. And of course, we know just from yesterday, from the release of the World Economic Outlook, that growth is going to be low. Global growth is not performing very well. The inflation pressure is still very much there. And so on the fiscal side, authorities will have to do their part to support, of course, the efforts on the monetary policy side to bring down inflation and, of course, deal with the vulnerabilities, debt vulnerabilities in many countries as well. At the same time, responding to social pressures, rightly so in a number of countries to support the most vulnerable populations that they have. So all of that underscores the even stronger case there is, always a strong case for spending well and spending with accountability, but no more important time to do so than now. And so this is the context in which countries must then make sure they're setting very good priorities and making sure they have transparent processes in the budget to actually have those priorities delivered upon through their budgets.
Right. Yeah. Well, you said it much more eloquently than I did. Spending well and spending accountably is more important today than it's ever been. That was the macro view. I want to take a few country sort of perspectives at this point. And Minister Ibrahimaj, if I can start with you, you, right before the pandemic, I feel like we all think of the pandemic as this moment of commonality where every country had a range of economic problems that it was thrust into. But as we were just discussing, of course, your country had a big earthquake right before. So you have faced a range of economic pressures, and you've had to figure out how to grapple with them, how to manage your country's finances amid those pressures. Just talk to us a little bit about the uniqueness of your country's situation.
Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to express my views. Yes, exactly. So Albania, in spite of the pandemics, which was a huge crisis, and the prices crisis that we're all facing right now, had the earthquake, which didn't only shake the earth, didn't only destroy all houses, thousands of houses actually, but it also was a big shake of our financial systems. Priorly to the earthquake, we were in a fiscal consolidation mode, and we were doing quite well, actually. So we had this shake that definitely got us unprepared of what was happening. And then right after that, it was in November 2019, and right after that, in March, the pandemics exploded. So we had to deal with the immediate demands of the earthquake and the immediate demands for replying to the people that were destroyed by the earthquake, the houses and their housing, with the pandemics, which stopped the entire world's economy. So to us, the issue of how to reply to people and how to spend with accountability mattered more because there was lives that were in stake, and it was really tough. So what we did was basically try to fulfill the immediate needs with flexibility of the budget, definitely. So we did all the budget arrangement in order to meet the needs of the people, and then without having in mind that we need to embark in a big reconstruction process, which, if I go back to that time and if I see what happened, which was a positive thing, because after the pandemics, we had this reconstruction program, which on the one hand definitely increased our debt because the financing needs were very high, but on the other hand helped our economy in order to go through the pandemic crisis. And then, so in general, what we did was to reply to the immediate needs while having a view on a resilient economy, on the growth, and also on an inclusive economy in order to focus where much was needed. And we did that in continuation, because then right after the pandemics, even if our economy started to react very well, we had the prices crisis. And we basically learned from that lesson and continued to reallocate our budget where the needs were, where the people were more affected, in order to address the high inflation, even if Albania was not hit by the inflation as at the proportion of the rest of the world, while keeping in mind that the huge debt increase that we faced during, right after the reconstruction, when the reconstruction program started, should be low. So should go on a downward pace. So it's easier said than done, because on the one hand, your expenditure have to increase, because you have to make up for people seeing their disposable income going down, and you have to do something in order to not affect the consumption of the economy. But on the other hand, you have to restrict your expenses. So
I'm gonna try and dig into that point a little bit more, because I think that's at the crux of what we're here for today, in a sense. And I'll come to you with this as well, Minister, but I thought I'd bring in Minister Marcel, because you know, I began this session by talking about the impacts on people, and you know, we were just hearing the Albanian perspective of balancing the books, and how hard that is as an economic challenge, as a challenge for an economist. But, you know, all of that sounds so dispassionate when people like us have these discussions, and then, you know, when real people have to react to them, it often leads to protest and unrest. And your country, sir, has faced civil unrest for years. How do you think through issues such as, you know, pension reform? You know, I mean, look at the problems that France is going through right now. How do you think through the risk-reward? And since these issues are so academic, how do you explain them to people who can often be quite angry?
Yes. Well, I think that I believe that there is a very important distinction to make in this discussion between spending well and spending enough. One thing doesn't necessarily lead to the other. When you spend well, that is not necessarily responding to all the demands and needs that you have in society. And sometimes you face the sort of constraints and distortions that emerge in small states. Let me elaborate on this because it has to do with very closely to your question. When you have very limited resources and you have responsibilities that fall upon the state, but you have the same resources, basically, yes, you can improve on efficiency, of course, that is necessary. But usually what the governments do is that they start shifting resources around. So you have an emergency, and then you move all the resources there, you reallocate from somewhere else. Then you have, let's say, an earthquake, like you said mentioned the case of Albania, but maybe later you will have a health crisis, or you will have a crisis on citizen security, and you will be forced to move resources around. So you will take from somewhere, from something that was important before to allocate to something that is important today. But these things do not cancel each other. They accumulate over time. And when that happens and the government doesn't have enough resources to respond to that, then you start trying to generate private solutions. But with private solutions come some other social problems. And part of what is behind the social unrest in Chile in 2019 is that people had to fund their studies with student loans. They have to take debt to cover for health expenses that were not insured. That people, especially the middle classes, got overburdened by debt. And then when you realize that, then you come to the conclusion that you need to keep in check the evolution of needs in society with the evolution of the resources that you have to respond to them. Because otherwise, you run this risk of entering this sort of vicious circle that create the seeds to criticize government because it's not doing enough, or because it is acting arbitrarily, or because there is corruption, because there is so much discretion in what people have to do. So, and that then erodes trust in government to generate the resources that are needed to respond to these issues. So the way I see it and the way to communicate it to people, at least in our case in Chile, is that for many years, from the early 2000s, we have since we adopted this structural budget rule, we have kept arguing that in order to fund permanent expenses, you need permanent funding. And permanent funding has to come from the tax system. So I think that that is something that has, that people understand, that is sort of common sense. And if you match that with an effort of trying to do the best with the resources that you have, I think that creates a sort of a trust environment in which you can propose and you can promote tax reforms to mobilize more resources for the government to respond to the needs of people. Mm-hmm.
Thank you for that. And let me bring in Nancy Gathungu finally. You're the Auditor General of Kenya. We've just heard from 2 finance ministers, and what I'm hearing, this is a session that is titled Spending Well, Spending Accountably. What I'm hearing is you cannot spend enough because of the range of crises that they are confronted with. Some of them expected, many of them completely unexpected. And especially when there's a humanitarian crisis, then you feel an especial need and responsibility to act and to deploy capital to try and fix problems. As an Auditor General, when you think of these kinds of big public crises, and your country as well has been through at least a similar set of crises over the last 3 years, how do you manage them? How do you examine the finances of a country And how do you push it towards fiscal responsibility while acknowledging all of these huge crises and challenges they have to deal with?
Thank you, Ravi. Indeed, speaking from the perspective of providing audit and assurance on how government responds to the crisis, and in Kenya, we did not only have COVID-19, but at the same time, we're having severe drought and locust invasion together with other countries. And it required the government to prioritize and communicate with the people. What do you address first? We have farmers who are demanding response to ensure that the locusts don't finish their products. And you have the drought ensuring that there'll be no new products or food. And what, as audit office in Kenya and across the globe from other auditors generals, the most important thing was to evaluate the adequacy of the systems that have been put in place to respond to crisis, how strong they are, how adaptable they are, and how well they can support extra budgetary support or funding coming in from various either development partners or other actors who are assisting the countries, and the points of receipt. We have funding and commodities that were coming in at the central government level, at the subnational level, at entity level, and at the private sector level. And coordination becomes very, very significant in that area. And we have to evaluate, does the system allow that coordination? And does it allow accountability and reporting during that time? From my experience, when the protocols were given out on what people should do, we found that actors that were defined as essential service providers did not include accounting and reporting. Accountants were not essential service providers. Auditors were not essential service providers. So you lose that trail and that accountability chain in the response to pandemics. And you lose information, and later scrambling to get that information right to raise the awareness level was very difficult. And the pandemic showed that no country was immune to this risk, whether the highly developed countries or the developing countries. The audit work that were done, or that was done by various auditors generals, indicated that there were vulnerabilities in the system. And it was very, very critical that those systems be strengthened to ensure that future crises are adequately responded to.
TMT Sayeh, let me bring you back in. When I hear all of this, so much of it is about systems and building better systems. It's about trust and fostering a sense of trust in the systems, which are stressed at normal times, but especially stressed at times of crises. So when you zoom back out to the macro picture that you have in this role, what kinds of things do you think countries need to think about as they try to manage a range of crises, the polycrisis, balance the books, but also make sure that the people trust them as they do it?
No, a very pertinent question, obviously, in this time of distrust. I think the population is very stressed, just as the authorities are, by all the crises that they've been contending with. And they want to be convinced that the scarcity of resources is appreciated by the authorities and that they're spending those limited resources in the best possible way. And so we've been talking about transparency already and the role that transparency can play in helping to rebuild that trust. And it is transparency not just on the spending side, but also on how effectively governments have been in mobilizing the resources they need. And in that context, of course, we know that in some countries with limited capacity as well and rudimentary PFM systems, there are often challenges around making sure that revenues are mobilized in a transparent way and in a treasury single account, as we refer to it sometimes, and that the resources that are mobilized by individual ministries, for example, when they give you a passport, when you apply for a passport, or when you go and apply for a driver's license, in some places and individual agencies are collecting those resources and not transmitting them to the central accounts, there are pockets of resources that are not mobilized and that are not transparently spent through the budget. So both on the revenue side, one has to make sure that one is working to bring those together in a transparent way, and of course in the budget, on the spending side, to make sure that expenditures, the processes in the system permit the public to be convinced that these are the priorities that are being financed. And so the Auditor General was talking about the work that she has been doing at the level of different levels of government in Kenya. And all of that has to be supported, of course, by work that we try to do to make sure that our member countries have the policy advice that we've gathered from working with all of our membership and learning from them in terms of how best to manage, to strengthen systems that help them to restore that trust. So we have, in the context of our surveillance work, which is the annual review we have with individual countries of their macro, including their fiscal side, lessons from that in terms of some of the fiscal rules, for example, that Chile is putting in place, and how effective that can be helping with these spending pressures. On the capacity development side, on technical assistance and training, and of course in our program context, and lots that is going on there, and lots that we take away from the response to the pandemic, where we really made sure that governments were spending as they needed to spend, but asked them to also commit to reporting transparently about that spending. And so we have, coming out of the COVID spending time, audits that were done to report on that, a publication of procurement contracts and beneficiary owners of those procurement contracts to make sure that that was transparently done and awarded as well. So all of those things together can help to rebuild that trust that is so critical.
Mm. So when one thinks about spending, Minister Ibrahimaj, I'll come to you on this. Spending well is what we sort of began this conversation with, but what is spending well? So when you have immediate crises, one thought is, I have to spend well to fix these crises now. But, policy planners could argue that if you really want to fix the problem, you need to focus on infrastructure and reform and things that people don't really see immediately. How do you balance that?
Well, I think that in this last 3 years, ministers of finance in general and all around the world, not only in Albania, have to be kind of superheroes because they need to
It's an unenviable job, for sure.
You need to build buffers, because what the crises have shown us is that you have to be prepared on what's next. Yeah. And crises are not ending, so you need to build buffers. And it's very difficult to explain to people, why do you need fiscal consolidation and why do you need to reduce debt? So on the one hand, you do have to do this, and on the other hand, you have to think of the immediate crisis and think of the future. Think of the need to continue investment. And one of the lessons that we have learned from pandemics is the need to invest in digitalization, not only in digital infrastructure, but also in digital skills. So, and of course, the social safety net and healthcare systems, and so there are very various type of needs that you need to accommodate in a very limited budget and fiscal space. So the private sector, I think, it's very important in this area because the state budget cannot do everything. So private investment should be mobilized, and budgets should find a way in order to mobilize more private investment. And definitely coming to the discussion of trust, it's important to communicate, to have transparency is of crucial importance, but it's also the results of your policies that do matter. And since we have been able to go through 3 different crises and to manage to have a good economic performance yet, Albania is growing at 2022 was 4.7%, so it's growing above the potential of the economy. So this is a very crucial thing. So you build trust by building policies that are transformed into economic growth. I must say it's quite difficult. For us, we had to take very difficult decisions. Many countries decided to cut their taxes, for example, in order to face what the economy was suffering. We didn't cut taxes. We found ways in order to mobilize new revenues, and I think that this is a very important element, that in times of crisis, in times of uncertainty, you shouldn't go with low taxation, which will bring more uncertainty in the future. And definitely, I might say that what we did during the pandemics was to protect families, to protect jobs, to protect the categories that were most in need, and this also helped us in order to build trust. Is this enough? No, nothing is enough, and we need to do more. But there's no special pill to this, to the environment that we are facing. And we're trying our best with the limited budget that we can.
Minister Marcel, I feel for the two of you in this discussion. We just heard you're not superheroes, but you have to be. But if you can, just expand on that point of the near term versus short term. And I imagine this is a question you have to ask yourself all the time. But again, we keep saying that we're in a polycrisis. We're at a time when we have these huge converging crises, and yet we are also needing to build resilience towards that other looming, bigger problem of climate change and the impacts it will have on our countries. So how do you, given all of that, think about the near term versus short term in a way that is spending well, to define the well in our topic, but also that explains to people that your intentions are as they are, that you're thinking through this thoughtfully?
Sure. Well, to add to this complementarity with the minister here, I think perhaps I could start with this issue of what spending well means. In my view, spending well means that you have a clear set of priorities on what the government does. Then you articulate, you have programs and institutions and so on that have objectives that are aligned with those priorities. And then you build the capabilities to deliver or to implement those programs, and you have the stability over time to ensure that you can persist long enough to make sure that the impact that you expect is delivered. Unfortunately, it is very common in many countries, and this is not only for emerging countries, it happens everywhere, that, for instance, many decisions on the allocation of resources, creation of programs, do not start by asking what the objective is. When you look at the budget and you ask, okay, what this money is for, very soon you find out that that was never spelled out. In Chile, we had a very traumatic experience with the reform on public transportation in Santiago, the capital city, a number of years ago. And well, people complained it was very badly implemented. But one feature of that experience is that for a reform of that size, the objective that you were pursuing was never spelled out. Now, why is that so important? Because then you can assess, you can evaluate what you're doing on the basis of those objectives that you were trying to pursue. I think it's much easier to communicate to people if something is working well or bad, if you can start by comparing with the objective that you were trying to achieve. I think that is a very, I would say, it's common sense, but it's amazing how lacking it is in many places everywhere in the world. Then I think that for us that work on finance, I think once you have those things clear, it is much easier to structure the budget in a way that explains better what you're doing with money. Budgets are incredibly complex. Nobody understands, if you distribute a budget bill, nobody will understand what is in there. But when you can organize the information and the allocation of resources around around objectives, around the programs that are trying to achieve that, then that is much easier to understand for everyone. And it's much easier to explain and to defend, because many times these initiatives come under attack. Or when you have an evaluation that is not positive, it is easier to know what to do. Because if the objectives are still valid, then the result of a bad evaluation is to reorganize and to do better, not to cut the funding. Because by cutting the funding, you're punishing the end beneficiary of that program or investment or whatever.
Now, all of this obviously raises the question of, it's one thing for us to have these discussions in a setting like this. It's how to translate that to a national audience, to build trust among regular citizens who may have varying levels of economic education or literacy, and to build trust in those kinds of groups. But we've discussed spending well for a bit now, and I want to move us to the final sort of strand of what I wanted to bring up today, and that is the access to information, information availability, and how we use that to inform what we do. Auditor General Gathungu, if I can come to you, I just want to get a sense from you of how audit agencies are trying to adapt their processes given the information that they've learned over the last couple of years, but also that given the information that you're able to capture from civil society, from individuals in the citizenry, from journalists.
I think maybe picking up from what the ministers have said, that in times of crisis, to spend well, first and foremost, you have to ensure that you have the revenues, the adequate revenues to respond to the crisis. And for countries that have enough contingency funding, can draw on those funds. But for countries without such kind of funds, then it means they have to reallocate or move funds from one program to another, which affects now development. Now, information is very, very critical. Audit offices are well placed to get adequate information on how governments are spending and how systems are working. And then we have civil society that are able to work with the people, the citizens, and give the other side of the story, so to speak. Auditors will look at it from the perspective of implementation. Citizens and civil society will give information from the perspective of impact and results. And you find that sometimes there's a disconnect between what the ministers for finance, for example, are working on and the objectives they want to achieve and what is actually achieved on the ground.
How do we fix that disconnect?
Auditors, yes, it's about doing work in a different way. For audit offices, it is not enough to just do the traditional audits of financial audits, compliance, or performance audits. We have to work now with the citizens. We have to engage, we have to partner with the citizens, and we are doing that. I think if you recall the UN Sayeh Symposium, that's the International Organization of Supreme Audit Institutions, in 2011 discussed how do Supreme Audit Institutions engage more with the citizens. So we are working and we are implementing audits where we work with the people. The people become part and parcel of the audit process. They give us feedback on whether there's results or whether there's impact with regard to the expenditures that are taking place, whether there is a change in their lives, on their livelihoods. So that partnership is critical. Communication is critical, so we have to work also with the media. In Kenya, we've been doing a lot of training for the media so that they're able to interpret the results of audit and even simplify the language because half the time the language of accountants and probably even economists it's not
journalists do not understand economics, I can tell you that.
It's not well understood by people who are maybe not financially literate or even as highly maybe educated. So we have to change the way we work. We have to do work that we turn around as quickly as possible to give information for decision making for maybe the ministers for finance. We can no longer carry out those long-term audits for 9 months or the cycle, the normal 1 year or annual cycle. We have to do shorter audits as near real time as possible that gives information to ensure decision making is timely and is adequate. And that's what we are working on towards to ensure that our work is more value adding for the decision makers. So that is very critical for us. And it means that by doing that kind of work, we enhance on our credibility and reliability of Supreme Audit institutions to give information that can be relied on, that citizens can trust because we've worked with them. Of course, putting parameters in place because, again, you have to be careful when you're working with civil society organizations that you get the correct data and information, you analyze and you draw the right conclusions. And quite a number of offices, we've seen those real-time and quick-time audits done in the UK. We've seen it in Netherlands, we've seen it in France by the heads of audits there. We've seen it in Sierra Leone based on lessons learned when they audited Ebola. And that is a way that we are going to go. Yeah.
So, DMD Sayeh, a lot of what I'm hearing here sounds amazing on paper. And it strikes me that, you know, building trust with people is a much harder thing to do in practice. And I come to you again for the cross-comparative perspective. You hear these wonderful proposals on paper and in practice in Kenya of training journalists, of involving the people. And as a journalist, I know you only build trust when you involve the people. But all countries are not doing this. Many countries do not even want to do this. The fund is so involved in, you know, the dissemination of accurate information and analysis. How do you step in then when there's a mismatch between, you know, what we know we need to do on paper and what countries actually end up doing?
Well, you know, this, you know, as a multilateral institution, of course, and working with our membership, we have a very important instrument at the fund, our surveillance work and our consultation with country authorities on an annual basis on their macroeconomic policies that are then assessed and evaluated in the context of the result of those consultations, which is the Article 4 reports, which most of them are published, and most of them are fairly are candid in terms of the staff's assessment of those policies, including the budget and fiscal policies more generally. And those can play a very important role in sharing information and evaluating how countries are performing relative to others. It's a very important tool for peer learning also, and for assessing yourself relative to your peers. And so countries are very aware of the importance of those reports, and they have, of course, an opportunity in the context of those reports when there are differences of views to spell out those their difference of views, and that is also there in the report. But it's a very important instrument. That's one piece. But we have various other means of getting information to the public through the analytic work that we do, cross-country analytic work that we do, through our, of course, the standards we apply for fiscal data, and that countries try to abide by because they're seeking to compare themselves with others. So the fiscal transparency, the code, and the fiscal transparency evaluations based on the fiscal code is a very important tool as well. But in the context of our program work that we have when we provide financing for countries to, typically many of them, especially when we're trying to help countries build that capacity to strengthen their budget and their reporting in the budget, you will see typically in some countries a reporting requirement on a quarterly budget execution report, for example, which is published, and is a basis in the context of the budget year itself, not at the end of it, for the citizenship to know how money is being spent. And the legislature, we haven't talked about the legislature yet, but this is a very important instrument of accountability. And this information can be made available to the legislature, of course, when the legislature is being asked to put in place a supplemental budget, for example, and has a quarterly report that shows that this particular ministry is not actually spending what it already has, and it's not doing so effectively. Why are we being asked them to supplement this budget of this ministry that is not performing? So those can be important instruments as well. And we, of course, work with civil society in the context of getting information out and available to the public. Mm.
Yeah. We're almost out of time here. So Minister Ibrahimaj, I'm going to ask you to just very quickly, you know, before we came on stage, you and I was just chit-chatting, and you mentioned that it's difficult to explain to people when you have to make a tough decision. And I just want you to expand a little bit on that. So when you hear, you know, from an Auditor General or from the IMF, you hear that there are all these measures and analyses and information to check the work of governments, to provide accountability, and people see these, or maybe they don't see these. How do you communicate with people, ultimately, to try and explain your case for what you're doing?
I was just listening to the two ladies before me, and I cannot approve more what they said. So on the one hand, I believe that we should locally be very engaged in communication, both as government officials. So we should be very clear and simplify our speeches as Minister of Finance or other officials, but also as the central bank officials. So our message should be clear and should be very well coordinated in order for people to understand well what's happening. But it's also very much important engaging with the civil society, engaging with journalists, because many times we are politicians, so what we say may not sound that trustful. While if civil society, which is totally independent, or journalists give the same message, then this helps into building trust and into explaining. On the other hand, it's very important that international institutions do their job and communicate well their job. In countries like ours, what the IMF says and states after Article 4 missions, for example, it's very important, and it's important in order to highlight what the government has done good and what has done wrong in some cases. And it helps the whole communication and the whole trust building between people and the government. So it's a mix of elements, and definitely, maybe this is not the case everywhere, but we should do more in order to increase financial literacy, increase people's knowledge about the basic concepts and what the fiscal policy decision-making, the monetary policy decision-making may bring us, and what wrong decision-making may bring us, them. So it's complicated, but I believe that both international institutions and local institutions are doing their job in order to better communicate in these times of crisis. And it's very important to be unified in the messages.
It is indeed. Well, I thank you for your self-awareness on that point. You're right. It isn't always the case that leaders are trusted by people intrinsically. You have to earn that trust. You have to build that trust, and you have to win it again and again and again at the elections. So I thank all four of you for joining us today and for being frank and candid and for pushing us towards solutions. My name is Ravi Agrawal again with Foreign Policy Magazine. I'd like to thank our four guests for their wonderful comments here today. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Ravi.